Hi there. My name is Dr. Joe Sutcliff Sanders. I'm a professor of children's literature in the English department at Kansas State University. I've been really impressed over the last several weeks with the outpouring of public discussion about some recent legislation out of the state of Arizona. You can find this new law for yourself under Title 15 Education, General Provisions Chapter 1, Article 1, Section 15-112. I've been especially impressed with all the young people who have reacted to their state legislature's decision to take specific books and specific classes out of the curriculum in Arizona, namely in Tucson. There has been a great number of moving video readings of the books that have been removed from classrooms, and I wanted to join that effort. Now, because I'm a professor, and professors hate to let texts talk for themselves, I'm going to join that effort by explaining exactly what's wrong in Arizona and exactly why one of these books needs to be put back into the classroom, ideally in exactly the courses that Arizona has recently, mistakenly, outlawed. What's really wrong here is this law. The law says that a certain kind of classroom isn't allowed. Now, the people who wrote the law will say that the law just wants to make sure that young people aren't being taught to rise up against their country. But the fact is that the law is written in such a way that it explicitly prohibits specific courses in Tucson that ask students to explore how race and ethnicity have played a part in history. And notice that the people who wrote this law have not complained about activist judges or activist school districts following the application of this terrible law, a complaint that legislators love to make when things don't go their way. Since they haven't complained, I have to assume that they agree with the way this law has been interpreted. So what classes are these classes that have been shut down? Well, a recent judicial ruling based on this terrible law specifies the classes, and the ruling also specifies the books that must be removed from the classroom. Tucson has promised that these books will remain available to students who want to check them out from the library. Mind you, I'm not sure what reports these students are going to be writing that require these books when the classes that use these books are now illegal, but Tucson has promised not to keep the books away from students who ask for them, even if teachers themselves are not allowed to use them. There are some mixed messages about whether and how the school district is going to allow at least one of those books into the classroom, but there are other books named in the ruling about which there are no mixed messages. One of those books is Paulo Freire's classic book, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed. I was shocked when I heard that this book was being pulled out of classrooms. You see, this is one of the most important books about how to teach well that has ever been written. It's not an exaggeration, in fact, to say that colleges and departments of education across the country have come to regard this book as fundamental to improving our teaching, about how to stop shoving our ideas down students' throats and let them ask us the questions they need to ask in order to participate in democracy. This is a book that professors and students and teachers and administrators pass around to each other, a book that people who care about good teaching read and reread and reread. And it's a book that, in the name of teaching young people well, Tucson has taken out of its classrooms. Well, I was curious about how taking a book about teaching out of a classroom could actually help teaching, so I went back, not for the first time, to Freire's book myself. What I found made me respect this critical book about critical thinking even more. It turns out that Freire's book is so sharp, so insightful, that Freire's book itself actually explains why people who fear good education would try to take this book out of the classroom. Here's what it says on page 20. Freire says that people who oppose teaching that helps make a strong democracy inevitably feel that, quote, it is better for the victims of injustice not to recognize themselves as such. However, Freire says, pro-democratic teaching, quote, does not lead men to destructive fanaticism. On the contrary, Freire says, pro-democratic teaching enables students, quote, to enter the historical process as responsible subjects, to, quote, search for self-affirmation, thereby avoiding fanaticism. In other words, the kind of teaching that Freire's book explains, the kind of teaching that this law seems to think has no place in Arizona classrooms, is exactly the kind of teaching that will keep people from trying to overthrow a proud, working democracy. Freire, because he was such an unbelievably good teacher, went on to explain to his readers why people who don't trust their students, people like the people who wrote this terrible law, will react in these predictably foolish ways. At the bottom of page 20 he writes, quote, such an individual is actually taking refuge in an attempt to achieve security, which he prefers to the risks of liberty. As Hegel testifies, men rarely admit their fear of freedom openly, however, tending rather to camouflage it by presenting themselves as defenders of freedom. Freire goes on, a couple of pages later, to criticize right-wing and left-wing sectarians, inviting teachers and students to think critically about everyone who would teach. At the top of page 32, he explains that teachers and students must look at all attempts at oppression and, quote, critically recognize its causes, so that through transforming action they can create a new situation, one which makes possible the pursuit of a fuller humanity. This is the kind of thinking that this law tries to keep out of the classroom. This terrible law, and the schools who have been forced to follow it, are actively preventing exactly the kind of democratic, thoughtful learning that should be the highest concern of people in a democracy. As Freire himself says on page 35 of this book, that is evidently the opposite of what Arizona wants in its schools, any act, such as this grotesque law, that professes to affirm freedom and yet does, quote, nothing tangible to make this affirmation a reality is a farce. This law is such a farce. Let Arizona teachers go back to helping all the young people of Arizona learn how to affirm freedom. Put books like this one and courses like the ones that used it back in the classroom.